The historical figure recognized as King Edward I was born at the Palace of Westminster, situated on the western boundaries of London at that time, during the early hours of the 18th or during the evening of the 17th of June 1239. Edward was born to King Henry III of England, a monarch who had ruled the nation since infancy but was only in his early 30s at the time of his actual establishment of authority. Henry was an exceptionally devout and religious individual who devoted himself to the veneration of Saint Edward the Confessor. In fact, he bestowed the name of the saint upon his eldest son. Edward's mother was the French noblewoman Eleanor of Provence, to whom his father wed 3 years prior to the child's birth. During an era when royal weddings were frequently orchestrated for political motives, Henry and Eleanor's union was radiant. She and Henry would have 4 more children in the years following the birth of Edward, a boy named Edmund and 3 girls named Margaret, Beatrice, and Catherine. Catherine passed away prior to her 4th birthday, whereas 3 of Edward's siblings would mature into adults. During the time that young Edward was conceived, England was undergoing significant political unrest. From 1199 to 1216, his grandfather, King John, ruled England. In many respects, he was a controversial and feeble monarch. During the early 1200s, he was involved in a sequence of catastrophic conflicts in France that led to the surrender of a significant portion of England's vast territories in the northern part of the country to King Philip II of France. Notably, the Duchy of Normandy, which had served as the foundation of the English presence across the English Channel, was among those territories that were lost. John was confronted with the First Barons' War, a revolt led by his own English peers, in the middle of the 1210s. Prior to his death in 1216, John implemented several political reforms, including the Great Charter, or Magna Carta of 1215, in an effort to pacify the unrest. However, the protracted succession of Edward's father when he was only 9 years old ensured that England's domestic unrest would not be resolved overnight. Henry III was a devout and, in many respects, an honorable monarch. However, throughout the majority of his protracted tenure, he was ineffectual and susceptible to dominance by court factions. As a result, Edward's youth was marked by political instability in England, additional civil unrest, a widespread uprising in Wales, and a lack of success in reclaiming former English territories in France on the international stage. Edward would eventually become entangled in the civil strife that characterized his father's reign, and he frequently opposed the king's own administration. Edward, similar to other royal children of his era, spent the majority of his upbringing in his own regal household, away from his parents. The letters received from the young prince's father exhibit a paternalistic regard, albeit possibly not of the sort that would be customary in the present day. In 1242, when Edward was approximately 3 years old, Henry voiced his concern that he was not providing him with high-quality wine. During his youth, Hugh Giffard was entrusted with Edward's care. In 1246, Bartholomew Peccei, a close friend of the monarch, was appointed to this responsibility. At this juncture, significant apprehensions emerged regarding Edward's well-being, and these challenges persisted until the early 1250s. Regrettably, the information regarding his educational background is limited. However, during this period, martial prowess and extracurricular activities like jousting and hunting held more significance than scholastic achievement for someone aspiring to the throne. Edward would consequently not be a scholar monarch. During the mid-1250s, Edward, who at an early age acquired the title Lord Edward, was bestowed with significant control over the crown's possessions beyond England, namely Gascony, Wales, and Ireland. These territories generated substantial income for Edward and afforded him a degree of autonomy from his father. Since 1256, Edward's senior position in Ireland has been denoted by his official seal. Edward wed Eleanor of Castile in 1154, when he was 14 years old, despite the fact that she was a year and a half younger than Edward. The political purpose of the couple's matrimonial union, which took place just before the Kingdom of Castile in Spain, was to strengthen English authority in the remaining French territory of Gascony, where they were both scarcely entering their teenage years. Notwithstanding its premeditated nature, the matrimonial union was exceedingly joyous. Edward and Eleanor were deeply in love, and she accompanied him wherever he went, even years later when they traveled to the Holy Land on crusade. An extended matrimonial union exceeding 5 years endured, bearing numerous offspring. The precise number remains uncertain during a period characterized by high infant mortality and stillbirth rates, but it is hypothesized that there were 14 in total. In general, they were born within the 20-year span from 1264 to 1284. However, only one son, the future King Edward II, and 5 daughters, Eleanor, Joan, Margaret, Mary, and Elizabeth, managed to reach maturity. However, Eleanor tragically passed away prior to her 30th birthday. Subsequently, a minimum of 8 of their children perished during infancy or childhood, an unfathomably high mortality rate even when compared to contemporary norms that befell Edward and Eleanor. Edward was entangled in the political unrest of his father's tenure by the late 1250s. A multitude of concerns, such as the king's perceived fiscal irresponsibility and his excessive backing of the Queen's French relatives at court, coalesced to compel a significant number of English lords and a portion of the influential French faction, spearheaded by Simon de Montfort, to exert pressure on Henry at an Oxford Parliament in 1258, compelling him to make concessions. A significant number of Henry's French councillors were removed from influential positions as a result of the provisions of Oxford, and the English government was essentially transferred to a group of 15 councillors chosen from the realm's most prominent magnates and nobility. Edward took a neutral stance on the matter and refrained from providing excessive support for his father. In fact, when the king was compelled to implement an even more radical series of measures in 1259, referred to as the Provisions of Westminster, the rebellious lords who carried them out had Edward's support. As a consequence of these events, the king's authority was significantly diminished, whereas Edward, who had recently felt stifled by his father, rose to a position of increased authority within this conciliar government system of the late 1250s. Although frequently perceived as a feeble monarch, Henry refused to concede to this restriction of his authority. In an effort to obtain the support of Louis IX, the French monarch, against his own nobles, he formally renounced English claims to the Duchy of Normandy and other French territories that had been effectively ceded to the French for more than 50 years. Henry, having received financial and military assistance from Louis in exchange, returned to England in 1260 and promptly initiated the process of re-establishing his regal authority. By the end of 1261, de Montfort had been exiled to France, and after much contention, Edward had reconciled with his father. He was recalled from Gascony, France, where he stabilized the region, after a fleeting deployment there in response to the ongoing unrest in England. In the spring of 1263, following de Montfort's return to England from France, a novel opposition movement started to take shape at Oxford. During the autumn, armed confrontations broke out between the king and his adversaries. By the winter of 1263, de Montfort's coalition of disputed peers had successfully taken control of London. On this occasion, a resolution was reached to designate King Louis IX to preside over the dispute as an arbitrator. However, Louis took Henry's side and suggested that the earlier provisions, which had been reached at Oxford and Westminster in 1258 and 1259, be nullified. As a result, de Montfort and his allies elected to resume hostilities, which led to the outbreak of the Second Barons' War. Edward was unwaveringly loyal to his father between the late 1250s and 1264, when the Civil War broke out. In April, he led the assault of Northampton, where a sizable baronial army was being amassed by one of Simon de Montfort's sons. However, the outcome of the conflict in the south determined its outcome, and by the beginning of that summer, things began to deteriorate significantly. On May 14, 1264, during the Battle of Lewes in Sussex, situated in the southeast region of England, the Royalist forces came into conflict with de Montfort's army. Although Edward effectively commanded the cavalry on the right flank of his father's army, the battle was ultimately lost due to de Montfort's forces holding a strategic position atop Offham Hill. Edward was subsequently captured and detained as a result, whereas Henry was compelled to make substantial concessions to de Montfort. A year passed during which de Montfort was essentially uncrowned King of England, but the situation changed when Edward fled and resumed amassing a royalist force in the Welsh marches. His position as the leader of the royalist cause had assumed significance due to the fact that his father was still a prisoner of de Montfort's. De Montfort was compelled to engage Edward in the field at Evesham on August 4, 1265, as a result of concerted campaigns that re-established rule over a large portion of northern and western England during the summer of 1165. Edward outmaneuvered de Montfort in this situation prior to the battle, which initially placed him on the defensive. Edward achieved a decisive triumph, which ultimately led to the demise of de Montfort and the king's eventual release. Even though victory was achieved at Evesham, the conflict continued. Battles persisted into 1266, having concluded in late 1265, when the final significant stronghold, Kenilworth, came under siege. Edward participated in this conflict for a limited period during the summer of 1266. The dictum of Kenilworth, promulgated in October, delineated the conditions under which individuals who had participated in rebellion could reclaim their territories from the monarchy. This resulted in the expectation that the garrison would capitulate. However, they persisted until December. Edward had already departed for the north to deal with additional operations aimed at expelling separatists there. The Lords launched their decisive assault on London in the early months of 1267. It was under the command of the Earl of Gloucester and presented a significant risk that the war's course could once more change, but Edward engaged in negotiations with Gloucester, who was ultimately swayed in his favor. As a result, proceedings started to wound down. A stance of greater amicability was adopted towards the remaining combatants, resulting in the abandonment of weaponry in numerous areas. Early in the summer, Edward led a campaign to the Isle of Ely, which was easily captured, while in early July, a final drive into the fens resulted in the surrender of the last rebels. With the conclusion of the Second Barons' War, Edward had significantly contributed to the triumph of his father's cause. Hastily, strategies were devised to achieve a political resolution with the intention of alleviating the strains that had precipitated the Second Barons' War. As a result, in November 1267, the Statute of Marlborough was promulgated, granting regal consent to the implementation of certain legal and fiscal reforms that had been advocated for briefly in the late 1250s and had been desired since then. It is unknown what role Edward participated in the discussions regarding these modifications. It is indeed challenging to ascertain precisely what his government function was during the latter half of the 1260s. He was frequently embroiled in disputes, including one concerning the Earl of Gloucester and his overlapping jurisdictions surrounding the city of Bristol. While there is some evidence suggesting that Edward participated in royal councils, it was not as extensive as one might have expected considering his prominence in the conclusion of the war. However, he did acquire substantial estates through the land confiscations that ensued after the conflict. In its entirety, his political apprenticeship had been uneven. Edward had amassed considerable expertise in military leadership and, to a lesser degree, administration. However, he had also earned a reputation for political manipulation, which is occasionally exaggerated, given that he had been amenable to his father's adversaries in the late 1250s but abruptly switched allegiances in the early 1260s. Edward, notwithstanding his father's advancing age and physical deterioration, resolved in the late 1260s to embark on a crusade to the Holy Land. In Europe, the Crusades constituted an integral part of daily existence throughout the High Middle Ages. The papacy began to urge monarchs, lords, and knights of Christendom in the 1090s that it was their solemn mission as God's faithful to attempt to reclaim the Holy Land, specifically the city of Jerusalem, from the Muslim heathens residing there. In the final years of the 11th century, a first crusade that resulted in the capture of Jerusalem and several other cities, including Antioch and Acre, and the establishment of 4 Crusader states was a tremendous triumph. Nevertheless, by the 12th century, these had diminished, and in 1187, the Muslim Lord Saladin successfully captured Jerusalem. The city remained beyond the control of the Christians in the early 1190s, notwithstanding the concerted effort of King Richard the Lionheart, Edward's great-uncle, to reclaim it during the Third Crusade. The decline of the other Crusader states continued well into the 13th century, notwithstanding the numerous subsequent crusades. Although Edward's father had long harbored ambitions of leading the crusade himself, he now assumed that responsibility instead. During the early 1170s, Edward embarked on what would later become known as the Ninth Crusade, but is more commonly known as Lord Edward's Crusade due to his pivotal role in it. In response to the threat that the Mamluk Sultan Baybars posed to the remaining Christian presence in the Levant, this doctrine was disseminated. At the time the Pope proclaimed the Crusade, the French monarch and his sons consented to carry the cross and undertake a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Consequently, Edward may have felt obligated to participate on behalf of the English royal family. However, his enthusiasm for the occasion leaves little room for doubt. Although the Crown contributed to the expedition's funding, Edward was responsible for a significant portion of the costs through his household, which was not an insignificant sum. In addition to the roughly 225 knights who consented to accompany the prince on his journey, several hundred additional troops and auxiliaries were present. The majority of these individuals were royalists who had fought for the crown in the civil wars of England during the 1250s and 1260s. Many of these nobles, who had only recently reconciled with the crown, were hesitant to participate in the royal expedition. Due to these factors, the crusade that commenced in England during the summer of 1270 was considerably more limited in scope than certain preceding campaigns. Recruitment had proven to be arduous, and financing was even more precarious, relying heavily on a loan of £17,500 from King Louis IX of France, the commander of the considerably larger French contingent, with the intention of retrospectively collecting taxes in England to cover the expense. Edward's army lagged behind the significantly larger French contingent and did not learn that King Louis IX had died of dysentery a few weeks prior when it eventually caught up with them in Tunis, North Africa, in the late autumn of 1270. In that location, Charles of Anjou, the recently appointed commander of the French contingent, engaged in negotiations with the Emir of Tunis. The agreement was to redirect the expedition to Sicily so that the French could attend to affairs in Italy, particularly in the southern region of the country, where they had become involved several years prior. Edward, incensed by this diversion, resolved to proceed with his small contingent along the initial course and proceeded eastwards as intended. By mid-May 1271, they had arrived at the Crusaders' stronghold of Acre in the Holy Land. It is possible that the Lord Edward's crusade achieved an immediate triumph upon his arrival. During that period, the Mamluk leader Baybars posed a threat to the Christian port. While some contemporary sources indicate that Edward's arrival averted an assault on the city, Arab sources are considerably less ecstatic about this development. Regardless, Baybars' appearance early that summer outside the ramparts of Acre with forces far superior to Edward's would have rendered him almost certain in possession of the city had he chosen to besiege it. Edward's albeit limited forces remained entrenched at Acre for more than 6 weeks prior to launching an assault on St. George de Labine, which was located approximately 25 kilometers from the city. Additional progress was impeded by the intense summer temperatures and a few cases of food poisoning. An early winter campaign targeting Kakin, situated approximately 65 kilometers from Acre, yielded more favorable results. The Crusaders were able to repel a Muslim force outside the city limits, but they were unable to capture the fortified citadel and were forced to retreat back to Acre. The fundamental challenge was that little could be accomplished with the extremely limited financial and human resources that Edward possessed in the aftermath of France's withdrawal from the crusade a year prior. As a result, it came as no surprise in early summer 1272 when Hughes III, King of Cyprus and nominal King of Jerusalem, reached a 10-year truce with the Baybars. Edward was indignant at the decision, but the Cypriot king was eager to capitalize on the Mamluk leader's hastiness to agree to such terms, which had become essential following the Mongols' extensive incursion into the Levant in late 1271, which had only momentarily jeopardized the Mamluk rear. However, this urgency quickly dissipated. Edward continued to reside in the Holy Land until September 1272. Throughout this period, he harbored hopes that Hughes might reconsider his position. However, the crusade had essentially come to an end. Almost certainly the most significant event of Edward's tenure in the Middle East was an attack that transpired one night in his bedroom, where he was critically wounded by an assassin. The individual responsible for orchestrating his demise remains uncertain. While certain accounts attribute it to Baibars, others attribute it to an enigmatic, old man of the mountains, who presided over an extremist branch of Islamism. Edward managed to repel and ultimately dispatch his assailant during this endeavor on his life. However, he sustained a puncture wound from a poisoned blade throughout the struggle. Subsequently, Eleanor, by all accounts, absorbed the poison from her husband's wound, potentially preserving his life. The couple departed the Holy Land in September 1272, realizing their lives were in imminent peril and that there was little that could be done to advance the Christian cause. In September, Edward departed for his return voyage to England. He departed with a Crusader presence that was temporarily precarious. Pressure from the Mamluk and others persisted in the years that followed, and throughout the 1270s and 1280s, Edward, like his contemporaries across Europe, was repeatedly petitioned for additional assistance to be dispatched. These were not heeded in any significant manner, and the Crusader presence in the Holy Land came to an end in 1291, when Acre was conquered by the Mamluks, nearly 2 centuries after it had begun. During the autumn of 1272, Edward traveled south through Italy en route home. Upon his arrival in early 1273, he was apprised of the momentous occasion, the death of his father the year prior in November. Consequently, he ascended to the throne of England. Nevertheless, notwithstanding the acquisition of this knowledge, he refrained from hastening to England. Conversely, he embarked on a leisurely expedition spanning Italy and southern France prior to reaching Paris in order to homage the newly crowned French monarch, Philip III, who, in theory, held Edward's domains in France under liege lordship. Edward then embarked on a visit to Gascony, where he beheld the scant remnants of England's possessions on the continent. Upon his return to England in August 1274, the nation had been monarchless for approximately 2 years. The preparations for Edward's coronation had been initiated in earnest prior to his arrival in England on August 2, 1274. Therefore, it became feasible to schedule the ceremony for the 19th of August, which was slightly more than 2 weeks later. Constantly, conflicts emerged regarding precedence. For instance, Edmund, Edward's brother, advocated for an expanded position for himself, having served as steward of the realm during Edward's absence. Similarly, a recurring dispute at medieval royal coronations pertained to the hierarchical status of the archbishops of Canterbury and York, which resulted in the exclusion of the latter from the ceremony entirely. Aside from that, everything ran efficiently, and the celebration was enormous. Thousands of cattle, oxen, pigs, and poultry were to be featured in an enormous banquet, while other staple foods of the Middle Ages and early modernism, including swan, crane, and goat, were being prepared. At significant financial investment, Westminster Abbey underwent a redecoration. It was the first time since the Norman conquest, more than 2 centuries prior, that both the King and Queen of England were crowned at the time of the coronation. Robert Kilwardby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, bestowed the crown upon Edward. Edward obediently removed the crown and vowed to abstain from donning it once more until England regained the territories that had been lost during his father's reign. He thus declared that the event marked the start of a new era. While it is common to portray the newly crowned monarch as a solemn Machiavellian, this depiction is not entirely accurate. Edward, who measured 6 feet and 2 inches in height, was given the moniker Longsharks due to his exceptional stature during an era when only a handful of men attained that stature. His once blonde hair was already darkening by the time he was crowned, and it would eventually turn grey during his middle years. Although he spoke with a minor lisp, he did so with intent and persuasion. Religiously speaking, he adhered to the established practices of his father and made the customary contributions to monasteries and churches. However, his level of religious devotion was nowhere near that of his father. Presumably lacking in literary erudition, he manifested his cultural inclinations through his patronage of painting and architecture, most notably endorsing Walter of Durham, who significantly contributed to the embellishment of Westminster Abbey's interiors. Although affable and good-natured by nature, he was also prone to violent outbursts. He had a passion for hunting and was an ardent advocate for the Arthurian legend being associated with the English monarchy. In spite of his administrative shortcomings, including a limited grasp of the intricacies of finance and logistics, he more than compensated for these deficiencies with his determination and assertiveness, qualities that had been absent in an English monarch for over 70 years, ever since the reign of his great-uncle Richard the Lionheart. A matter of significance that emerged during Edward's reign in England originated in Wales to the west. Following their conquest of England in the 11th century, the Normans exerted considerable authority over Wales, which they maintained and even strengthened for much of the 12th century. However, the English crown's decline during the reigns of Edward's grandfather and father instigated a series of Welsh princes' rebellions there, led by Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, in an effort to re-establish the independence of Wales. Nevertheless, ap Gruffydd neglected to recognize that by the 1270s, the English monarchy had strengthened its position. As a result, Edward anticipated that Llewellyn would condense his reverence, just as his predecessors had customarily done. In the 1200s and 1210s, his grandfather, Llewellyn the Great, had bestowed homage upon King John and Henry III, respectively. Therefore, upon learning of Llewellyn's incursion into English territory in the March region, Edward regarded it as the conduct of an insurgent subject and resolved to retaliate. This was facilitated by the fact that ap Gruffydd had estranged a number of the Welsh nobles who had sought asylum at the English court. Consequently, during the summer of 1277, Edward, commanding a fleet in support, advanced into northern Wales at the head of a massive royal army of 15,000 men. Violence was not required. Llewellyn discerned that this colossal display of power served as a warning that his ambitions required moderation. As a result, he and Edward reached an understanding via the Treaty of Aberconwy, which severely restricted Edward's authority in Wales and required him to remit a substantial indemnity of £50,000 to the English crown. As a result, the reverence bestowed by Welsh nobles upon monarchs, including Henry II in the 12th century, was reinstated expeditiously during Edward's reign. This undoubtedly failed to resolve the issue. Edward encountered a coalition of Welsh princes in 1282, during which a fresh conflict erupted. During this conflict, a number of the princes who had previously allied with him in 1277 were disenchanted with his failure to adequately compensate them for their assistance following the invasion. Subsequent to Llewellyn's sibling Dafydd's April assault on Harden Castle, additional assaults were launched against English fortifications in the vicinity. Edward exhibited a level of determination comparable to that which he had exhibited 5 years prior. From his perspective, Llewellyn and the other Welsh peers were not autonomous princes of an unfamiliar realm. Rather, they were insurgents of a long-ruling English nation who were declining to duly honor him as their monarch. Edward would ultimately adopt the same mentality when it came to England's northern neighbour. Once more, a sizable army was gathered and dispatched to northern Wales with the objective of encircling the stronghold of ap Gruffydd in Snowdonia. Upon subsequent attempts to escape the encirclement and reach central Wales, Llewellyn met his demise in combat at Stirling Bridge on December 11, 1282. His brother Dafydd's endeavours to sustain the war were vain. Thus, exactly 1 year after the conflict had begun, in April 1283, the final stronghold of the Welsh capitulated. Shortly thereafter, Dafydd ap Gruffydd was executed after being transferred to Edward's administration. This effectively severed the opposition of the most prominent opponents of English intervention in Wales. The English's 1283 victory marked one of the most comprehensive defeats in the history of Welsh independence. With the passage of the Statute of Wales in 1284, English systems of government were extended to Wales. New counties in the English manner were established, and English local government was implemented. A considerable number of Welsh nobility were disinherited, and their territories were bestowed upon English subjects of Edward. In order to solidify the newly established English dominion, an extensive campaign of fortification construction was initiated at locations such as Conwy, Carnarvon, and Harlech. Rival communities, including Flint, Aberystwyth, and Rhuddlan, witnessed the rapid emergence of new towns, while endeavours were undertaken to Anglicise pre-existing Welsh towns. Notwithstanding these constraints, it would be erroneous to presume that Edward I successfully concluded the English conquest of Wales. Both 1287 and 1294 witnessed rebellions, with the latter necessitating a substantial deployment of English military forces. In one capacity or another, nearly 30,000 men participated in the uprising until its cessation in the spring of 1295. In its entirety, the undertaking sidetracked Edward from challenges he was encountering in other regions during the 1290s and demanded a substantial financial investment of £55,000 from the Crown to subdue, thereby underscoring the enduring precariousness of authority over Wales. The financing of the armies that were stationed in Wales at different times during the period from the mid-1270s to the mid-1290s was a significant concern for an administration that sought to significantly reassert English power on multiple fronts. In response, a comprehensive restructuring of the English government and finances was initiated with the objective of augmenting the revenue to the exchequer. As soon as Edward was crowned, he appointed Robert Burnell, a close ally, as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Burnell promptly proclaimed the formation of an inquiry commission tasked with examining diverse facets of government finances and administration. The principal objective of this commission was to ascertain undetected territories that were under the ownership of the sovereign but lacked corresponding records. Despite the varied outcomes, this investigation did have an impact on the development of the Comprehensive Statutes of Westminster, which were officially published in the early spring of 1275. This was the initial of a series of measures implemented until 1290 that aimed to eradicate land tenure abuses and subinfeudation, which resulted in the feudal dues of landowners being deprived of their property. Tenants' rights were also safeguarded, although the sovereign endeavoured to prevent lands from being granted away by institutions other than the church or others without royal authorization, so as to maximize its revenue from such transactions. In general, this legislation brought about significant transformations to the realm of land ownership, debt, and the finances of the monarchy in medieval England. Although the Inquiry of 1274 and the Statutes of Westminster that followed in 1275 initiated the reformation of specific aspects of landholding and other matters concerning the monarchy, they failed to resolve the fiscal dilemma. In response, further fiscal measures were implemented in the year 1275. 6 shillings and 8 pence in customs duty was imposed on sacks of fleece exported from England. During that period, the cloth trade in England was substantial, and this modest customs duty contributed around £10,000 annually to Edward's exchequer, which is equivalent to tens of millions of pounds today. In addition, a singular tax equal to 15% of the value of movable commodities was levied. This tax resembled a wealth tax from the Middle Ages and generated in excess of £80,000. In addition to these measures, reforms to the administration of the exchequer were implemented in 1279, and the Church was subject to additional taxes thereafter. In the aforementioned year, a recoinage operation was initiated with the dual objectives of eliminating counterfeit coins from circulation and providing the sovereign with an additional financial gain through the reissuance of new coins. Such measurements were routinely required during an era when the value of coins in circulation was primarily determined by their silver content. Although these financial reform efforts were generally fruitful, they ultimately failed to provide Edward's government with the means to cover the expenses incurred during its campaigns throughout the years. An example of this is in the early 1280s, when unrest erupted once more in Wales. The crown was taken aback and funds had to be raised immediately. In the beginning, in excess of £16,000 was borrowed from the affluent merchant communities of the municipalities in order to cover the shortfall. Early in 1283, when this failed to address the military situation effectively, regional assemblies were convened in various districts and the north of England. Additionally, they consulted with Italian merchant financiers, including the Riccardi family, whose banking influence had spread throughout a significant portion of Western and Central Europe by the late 13th century. All of this demonstrated that notwithstanding the efficacy of the reforms implemented in the 1270s, England was incapable of financing a protracted war effort without resorting to extraordinary means of raising additional funds. As a result, additional exchequer reforms were implemented during the 1280s, most notably the Statute of Rhuddlan, which sought to eradicate some of the pervasive corruption that plagued all pre-modern societies and enhance bookkeeping. As a result of these measures, the administrative apparatus of the English state under Edward ultimately became more streamlined throughout his reign. During the 1270s and 1280s, all of this legislation and fiscal improvement transpired against the backdrop of parliamentary reform. Presently, the Magna Carta, a document ratified during the final months of King John's tenure, is often regarded as the seminal constitutional moment of the High Middle Ages in England. However, this perception is largely unfounded. Although it guaranteed certain privileges for the English nobility in their association with the Crown, the Legislative Assembly, which would later become the prototypical mother parliament of modern democracy, began to take shape during Edward's reign. These developments were far more consequential. For example, Edward was responsible for supervising the inception of the system that retrofitted members of Parliament to the contemporary era. This establishment mandated the return to Parliament of 2 nobles from each county and 2 burgesses from each corporate town. Thus, national representation was initially implemented. This foreshadowed the constituency system by which the majority of contemporary democracies currently elect their parliaments. Furthermore, during his inaugural parliament in 1275, Edward instituted a customary practice of seeking parliamentary authorization for extraordinary taxation. This innovation was implemented with the intention of circumventing the constitutional disputes that had plagued the reigns of his father and grandfather. Edward's primary contribution to English parliamentary developments was the establishment of a symbiotic relationship between the realm and the subjects. The government and monarchy could levy taxes in exchange for reforms and favors from the nation. Effective operation of this system persisted until the 17th century. In other locations, administrative and financial achievements were observed. Although Irish affairs are rarely discussed in scholarly accounts of Edward's reign, notable progress was made throughout his more than 4 decades in office. A significant portion of the land was initially subjugated by England in the late 12th century, although certain regions continued to be independent of English governance. During Edward's reign, it continued to grow, albeit primarily due to the English nobles' initiative. However, 2 measures are noteworthy. Initiated in 1292, a lay subsidy tax was subsequently utilised to finance the formation of a new Irish Parliament comprised of elected representatives, which convened for the first time on December 1, 1297. It persisted for more than 500 years until the Act of Union merged the Irish Parliament with the Westminster Parliament of England. Furthermore, during Edward's tenure, the court system in Ireland underwent a significant transformation and enlargement. Centralised courts were established in Dublin, while regional courts were established in the provinces to administer justice in accordance with the common law. By the conclusion of Edward's reign, Ireland had generated a substantial profit for the English exchequer. English political commentators during the early modern period would consider the early 14th century to be the pinnacle of English rule in Ireland, based on a perspective that spans more than 250 years. An additional concern that had an effect on the finances of Edward's dominion was the status of the Jewish people. In England, a considerable Jewish population had established itself between the late 11th and 12th centuries. Similar to other regions in Europe, a considerable number of Jews engaged in money lending due to the lucrative nature of the business and the Roman Catholic Church's proscription of usury, extortionate interest on loans made to non-Christians. Hence, in light of the numerical composition, the Jewish community in England assumed a substantial role in the nation's economy by the early 12th century. This occurred concurrently with the rise of anti-Semitism in England. Judaism was considered to have committed deicide, or the assassination of God, by medieval Christians due to their support for Jesus's execution. This, in conjunction with the matter of Jewish moneylending and their expanding influence in the economy, resulted in heightened persecution of the Jewish community throughout Edward's father's lengthy reign, particularly through the imposition of extraordinary taxation and the exertion of intense pressure on the Jewish people to convert to Christianity in order to extract substantial sums of money. Edward expedited the implementation of these anti-Semitic policies upon assuming the throne. The Statute of Jewry, enacted in 1275, prohibited the practice of usury among Jews, absolved numerous debtors of their obligations to Jewish moneylenders, confined them to ghettos in specific cities and towns, and mandated that all Jews over the age of 7 wear a yellow badge signifying their Jewish identity. Moreover, specific taxes were levied on all Jews aged 12 and above. After 15 years, in 1290, Edward decided to expel the entire Jewish population from England after concluding that a significant number of Jews continued to act as moneylenders throughout the country. As a result, these extremely punitive measures lasted for only 15 years. In the late 1280s, having recently returned from a journey to his French possessions in Gascony, Edward was compelled to impose additional taxes to fund the campaign. In order to gain the favor of the nobility and gentry, he incorporated a pledge to expel the Jewish community from England, a commitment he dutifully fulfilled in 1290. This additionally facilitated Edward's seizure of Jewish lands and properties for the sovereign, which he subsequently sold for a substantial profit. During the early 1290s, England expelled a relatively rapid number of Jewish individuals. An estimated 2,000 to 3,000 were exiled. The majority of these individuals sought refuge in Eastern Europe, a region considerably more accepting of their presence. A minority persisted in England while assuming the guise of Italian financiers. Edward, similar to his progenitors, harbored a preoccupation with France, albeit in a distinct fashion compared to previous English monarchs. In the 1250s, his father negotiated agreements with the French that successfully reconciled the English crown with the substantial territorial losses in northern France, most notably the Duchy of Normandy that had befallen King John in the 1200s. Consequently, Edward was not obligated to seek the re-establishment of English dominion over Normandy and other regions, as had been the case during the initial years of Henry's reign. However, the English monarch maintained a significant influence in France, particularly in Gascony, located in the southwestern part of the country. As a result, Edward was inextricably linked to French affairs. He frequently traveled to Gascony with the intention of initiating reform movements there, with his most notable visit occurring in the late 1280s. As a consequence, in 1289, a comprehensive set of reforms was reached and agreement upon, with the intention of governing the behavior of high-ranking English officials in Gascony, including the seneschal of the region and the constable of Bordeaux. However, the primary obstacle that Edward encountered in Gascony was that he ruled the region as a fief of the French monarch rather than independently, a circumstance that would escalate into conflict in the 1290s. Edward had upheld amicable relations with King Philip III of France, who had ascended to the throne after Louis IX died in Tunis in 1270 during his pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Edward honored Philip during his mid-1270s sojourn through France en route back to England from the Crusades. In 1279, Edward revisited Paris after the procession. On this occasion, significant disputes between the two kingdoms were successfully resolved, resulting in a favorable state of relations between the United Kingdom and France. The amicable relations that existed between Edward and Philip IV, the heir apparent to the throne who ascended to power in 1285, rendered the commencement of war between England and France in the 1290s an exceptionally peculiar occurrence. A localized conflict between England and a few French merchant mariners operating in the English Channel precipitated the incident. Philip interpreted Edward's action against these elements in his capacity as Duke of Aquitaine, the title he held as Lord of Gascony, as an act of rebellion, whereas Edward believed it was wholly justified in his capacity as King of England. Thus, the conflict that erupted in 1294 was precipitated by Edward's overlapping jurisdictions as both a subject of the King of France and an equal of the King of France as King of England and Duke of Aquitaine. Following a series of military confrontations with French merchant vessels in the English Channel, Philip compelled Edward to appear in Paris and provide an explanation for his conduct. In order to avoid appearing submissive to a fellow monarch in this manner, the English monarch dispatched his brother Edmund in his stead. A mutual agreement was achieved at this juncture. Edward would relinquish a few minor fortifications in Gascony as collateral, in exchange for his matrimonial union with Margaret, Philip's sister, who was approximately 40 years his junior. Having been wed for 36 years prior to Edward's death in 1290, Eleanor, his first wife, was able to consummate the marriage of the sister of the French monarch in order to mediate the dispute that had emerged in the English Channel. Nevertheless, the entire scheme was revealed to have been a deception orchestrated by Philip to secure the Parliament of Paris's support by seizing the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward. Edward's intentions underwent a transformation with the advent of full-scale war. Consequently, he started to formulate aspirations to reclaim certain territories that his ancestor had forfeited 90 years prior. Early on in the conflict, Edward devised a plan to form a formidable alliance of continental powers against the French. With the powerful Duke of Burgundy, who ruled vast territories in eastern France, and among the numerous principalities of the Low Countries and western Germany, which were divided into dozens of small dukedoms, counties, and city-states during the late Middle Ages, he sought alliances in particular. Edward aspired to establish a military stronghold in the Low Countries, specifically in the counties of Guelders, Holland, and the Duchy of Brabant. This would enable England to launch an offensive from northeastern France towards Paris, as opposed to the French expectation that it would operate from Gascony. This course of action was postponed until 1297, during which period the English had experienced a series of unfavorable outcomes in their engagements with the French in Gascony. Ultimately, the military expedition in the Low Countries resulted in an ill-fated catastrophe that Edward was not able to salvage himself from until the spring of 1298. Therefore, this approach definitively failed in the closing years of the 13th century. However, Edward's grandson would successfully implement the concept of forming an alliance of European allies and launching an assault against France from the Low Countries many years later. Despite the negotiation of a truce in late 1297 and the subsequent conclusion of the war against France, the war remained protracted despite the conclusion of the most concentrated phase of Edward's Grand Alliance. When the previously negotiated matrimonial union between Edward and Philip's sister Margaret materialized in 1299, a significant milestone was reached. The married couple, who were separated by 40 years of age, exchanged vows in Canterbury on September 10, 1299. Despite their age disparity, the union proved to be reasonably amicable for both individuals involved. Margaret bore Edward 2 sons and a daughter, and subsequent to Edward's demise several years later, she refrained from remarrying. Concurrently, in 1303, the conclusive peace terms between England and France were established, effectively restoring the situation to its pre-bellum state. For both factions, the war had proven to be an expensive failure. Edward's exchequer spent an estimated £350,000 on military operations in Gascony alone. During the 1290s, the English government contributed over £150,000 to the minor states of the Low Countries and Germany in an attempt to secure their assistance, but to no avail. Due to the exorbitant financial burden of the war, a formal coronation was postponed for Margaret in order to spare the associated expenses. This expenditure in France and the Low Countries was especially vexing for Edward, as his foreign policy objective had shifted from France to Scotland during the course of the conflict. In 1286, King Alexander III passed away in that location, bequeathing Margaret of Norway, his 3-year-old granddaughter, as his successor. However, with Margaret's death in 1290, the more than 120-year reign of King William the Lion's direct line in Scotland came to an end. There were currently more than a dozen candidates vying for the Scottish throne, but Robert Bruce, the 5th Lord of Annandale, and John Balliol, the Lord of Galloway, were the most prominent. To avert a descent into civil war, the Scottish Council of Guardians, which had been appointed to govern during Margaret's adolescence, petitioned King Edward to serve as an arbitrator. Edward perceived this circumstance as a chance to reinstate a more substantial level of English dominion over matters pertaining to Scotland. Similar to Wales, Edward considered Scotland to be a subordinate realm within the Kingdom of England. Since the late 11th century, when William the Conqueror and his successor, William II, established a degree of Norman control over the Northern Kingdom, England had exerted considerable influence over Scotland. Although this had slowed over the course of the century preceding his accession, Edward saw the succession crisis as an advantageous occasion to reassert the English regal authority in Scotland. Consequently, subsequent to endorsing John Balliol's ascension to the throne as King John I in 1292, Edward unequivocally declared his perception of Balliol as a vassal, obligated to homage both Balliol and Scotland as a quasi-subject realm. However, Balliol and the Scots were unyielding in their opposition. Following the outbreak of war between England and France in 1294, Balliol not only declined to dispatch Scottish troops to assist Edward but also initiated alliance negotiations with the French. This factor significantly influenced Edward's 1296 decision to invade and occupy Scotland. In March 1296, Edward issued the command for an army to assemble at Newcastle upon Tyne. Simultaneously, he dispatched envoys north bearing Scots' demands that they surrender the border fortresses of Jedburgh, Berwick, and Roxburgh as security against any possible alliance they might establish with the French. Not only did the Scots decline this offer, but on March 26, 1296, a Scottish army under the leadership of John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, advanced south into England in opposition to Carlisle Castle. In this location, Edward had designated the 6th Lord of Annandale, Robert Bruce, as the administrator of Carlisle Castle. Even while within England, the willingness of certain Scottish lords to perform servitude for the English monarchy indicates that they, too, regarded Edward as a sovereign with substantial authority over Scotland at the time. Bruce's son and namesake would significantly influence the course of Anglo-Scottish relations for the next 3 decades. Although unsuccessful in seizing Carlisle Castle, Comyn's forces set fire to the town, and the Scots conducted additional border attacks throughout the month of April. However, this marked the cessation of military developments for the Scottish in 1296. Edward led his forces into Scotland via the River Tweed in late March. Berwick, which was the southernmost outpost of Scotland at the time, was captured within days. Edward established his headquarters in this location to deliberate on his next course of action, while the Scots readied themselves in the vicinity of Dunbar Castle, situated a few miles up the Scottish coast from Berwick. The initial phase of what would develop into a protracted 30-year conflict between England and Scotland was resolved at this location. On April 27, 1296, Edward's forces, under the leadership of John de Warenne, 6th Earl of Surrey, engaged the Scots, commanded by John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, in the Battle of Dunbar. Based on the available evidence, it can be inferred that this conflict predominantly involved 2 cavalry forces of modest size, comprising no more than a few hundred heavy cavalry on each side. Having established a formidable position on the high ground, the Scots' lines disintegrated when they detected the English troops retreating from the battlefield. As a result, a well-coordinated English cavalry charge successfully deceived the Scots, compelling them to retreat. Approximately 100 Scottish nobles and knights were captured, and Dunbar Castle capitulated the day after Edward made his personal appearance. Following the conflict, A number of additional significant castles situated in lowland Scotland readily acquiesced to the invading forces of Edward. Edinburgh Castle withstood for a week before succumbing to the siege. A limited campaign had thus concluded with Edward achieving an absolute victory. In the hopes of receiving mercy, King John Balliol capitulated, but Edward deprived him of his throne and dispatched him south to England in captivity. Following this, Edward personally embarked on a journey south while transporting the Stone of Scone, which has long been revered as the inauguration stone of Scottish monarchs. The significance of this was unambiguous. John was deposed as King of Scotland, and Edward would be the sole monarch of the realm henceforth. Edward perceived this as a straightforward culmination of a series of events that commenced more than 2 centuries prior, when William the Conqueror and William II initiated the establishment of English dominion over Scotland. Following the campaign of 1296, the English assumed control of the Scottish government in its entirety, establishing garrisons in strategic locations across the nation. Nevertheless, despite this, the victory was ultimately secured far too readily, and the Scottish resistance never truly surrendered. Furthermore, the resumption of Edward's preoccupation with events in France expeditiously created the conditions for a rebellion in 1297. This endeavour was under the direction of 3 individuals. Robert Bruce, who would subsequently ascend to the throne of Scotland many years later, was the grandson of Robert Bruce, a candidate to the throne in the early 1290s prior to Balliol's coronation. A second rebel commander was the eminent esquire from northeastern Scotland, Andrew de Murray. Third, and without a doubt the most renowned, was Sir William Wallace. Wallace, notwithstanding subsequent portrayals that portrayed him as a romantic dissident of the Commons, in fact belonged to the lower nobility of Scotland. Acting independently of each other to begin with, the trio managed to incite popular revolts against English rule across the country, which culminated in a first significant victory over English arms at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September 1297. Following Murray's fatal wounding at Stirling Bridge, Wallace was elected as Guardian of Scotland, a position akin to that of a regent elected by the Scottish nobility in the absence of a monarch. Edward was presently incapable of taking further action in retaliation. During the year 1297, he was occupied with the supervision of a meticulously organized operation involving his former allies in the Low Countries. Possibly most significantly, he encountered the most severe domestic unrest of his reign within England itself, as church leaders and nobility voiced numerous complaints about the monarch's failure to consult with them adequately regarding the financial implications of the wars in France, Scotland, and Wales. Edward, fully cognizant of the anguish that fractious nobles had wreaked on his father and grandfather, moved swiftly to justify his actions by publishing a lengthy letter in which he expressed regret for his recent authoritarian rule, but contended that it was indispensable for the expeditious resolution of the wars. The nobles, who had petitioned for an amendment to Magna Carta, the Great Charter that King John and his nobles had agreed to in 1215 to enshrine respect for their rights, were not wholly appeased. Although this was not approved, assurances were given that the nobility would not be subjected to such extraordinary demands in the future. Unwittingly, the Scottish uprising may have bolstered Edward's cause, as subsequent Scots raids into northern England following the Battle of Stirling Bridge persuaded a significant portion of the English populace that his appeals for extraordinary taxation and other demands, which were warranted in the midst of an emergency, were legitimate. Edward reacted swiftly to the Scots' incursion upon his return to England in the spring of 1298 from Flanders. Edward led northward a vast army of more than 20,000 soldiers, the majority of which were Welsh infantry that had been mobilised in the mid-1290s in an act of loyalty in response to the major Welsh uprising. The assemblage took place at Roxburgh in late June, and Edward departed from this location in order to travel north towards Falkirk. On July 22, 1298, he encountered Wallace's army in the field at this location. Although Edward's forces dominated the Scots numerically, the sizable Welsh contingent was a fractious bunch. The Scots constituted an approximate army of 6,000 men, of which 4,000 were long spearmen organized into 4 schiltrons, which resembled hedgehog phalanxes and were utilized to repel any assault, including that of heavy cavalry. The spaces between these were subsequently occupied by more than 1,000 archers and roughly 500 cavalry. The previous year, these schiltrons were utilized with devastating results at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. However, they were not as effective this time around, as thousands of Edward's crossbowmen and archers used his cavalry to encircle the Scots and hold their spearmen in place as they were bombarded with projectiles. Both parties had lost over 2,000 men by day's end, but this was a catastrophic loss for Wallace, whose forces were considerably smaller than Edward's. Edward was unable to re-establish dominion over the entirety of Scotland in the months that followed his victory at Falkirk. Instead, he confined his dominion to the fortresses situated along the border and in southern Scotland. Furthermore, ongoing affairs in France and Edward's matrimonial union with Margaret served to divert his attention once more to external matters in 1299, thereby facilitating the Scots' successful recapture of Stirling Castle subsequent to an extended period of siege. Edward was able to devote more attention to Scotland beginning in 1300, when the war in France was essentially over. However, despite conducting annual campaigns into the country, Wallace and the other Scottish leaders were unwilling to risk another major defeat like the one that had occurred at Falkirk. Consequently, Edward encountered an adversary in the early 1300s who was averse to engaging him in direct combat. However, triumph could also be achieved through strategy and diplomacy. Edward successfully wooed Robert Bruce to his cause in 1302, but the subsequent year's peace in France put an end to any prospects of assistance from that theatre for the Scottish. Many of the Scottish nobles reconciled with Edward a year later, following the English retake of Stirling Castle. A further blow was inflicted to the Scottish cause in the autumn of 1305 when Scottish Knight John de Menteith, loyal to the English crown, captured and handed over William Wallace near Glasgow to Edward's government. On August 23, 1305, he was transported to London, where he was mounted, drawn, and quartered at Smithfield. In the interim, Edward strengthened his authority over Scotland through the appointment of Royal Lieutenant of Scotland, John of Brittany, his nephew and the son of Edward's sister Beatrice. Additionally, English officials were installed in positions of Chamberlain or Chancellor within the Scottish government. English constables were appointed to supervise the border towns and fortresses, and sheriffs were also established in the lowland regions as this progression continued lower in the hierarchy. The decision to appoint English judges to certain positions on the Scottish bench and to initiate a review of the Scottish legal system in an effort to harmonise it with the English common law served to underscore Edward's near-total victory once more. Similar to the choice to remove the regal inauguration stone from Scone in 1296, additional symbolic gestures were employed to underscore Scottish subjugation. Notably, English correspondence from this period referred to Scotland as land instead of kingdom. It would be determined that Edward's triumph in 1305 was just as transitory as the one he attained in 1296. On February 10, 1306, during a meeting at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries, close to the Anglo-Scottish border, Bruce executed Robert Cummin, one of the only 2 viable remaining candidates for the Scottish throne. The dispute arose due to Cummin's attempt to renege on a stipulation in which one of them would abstain from their throne claim in exchange for a grant of domains that would establish him as the principal magnate in Scotland, while the other would ascend to the throne. 5 weeks after Bruce assassinated Cummin, he proclaimed himself King of Scotland, bringing an end to a 10-year stalemate in which Edward had effectively governed the northern kingdom without a monarch north of the border. Scone, the customary location for anointing Scottish monarchs, served as the symbolic location for the inauguration, notwithstanding Edward's confiscation of the inauguration stone and subsequent transportation of it to England a decade prior. In an effort to sanctify the event, royal garments were extracted from storage. Robert thus instigated a fresh uprising against the English dominion over Scotland. Bruce's rebellion in early 1306 may have been a fortuitous maneuver intended to capitalize on Edward's deteriorating health. The monarch was approaching his 70th year at this point, which, by the standards of the late Middle Ages, was an advanced age. Notwithstanding his physical ailment, a considerable military force was assembled and deployed north under the leadership of Henry Percy, Aymer de Valence, and Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke. An additional force was enlisted under the command of the Prince of Wales, who would later be crowned Edward II. In the interim, Edward became exceedingly vengeful in retaliation for this latest setback in a decade-long struggle for victory and was resolved to prove that he considered this to be treasonous. Due to their shaky ties to Bruce, a number of prominent Scots residing in England were executed between the summer and autumn of 1306. Others were publicly displayed in cages at certain border fortifications in southern Scotland, which was an exceptionally unusual form of punishment at the time. Bruce's initial campaign did not progress favorably. Midway through June 1306, de Valence engaged in negotiations with Bruce at Methven, Scotland, having deployed their forces on the battlefield. Due to the late hour of the day, both parties reached a mutual agreement to postpone combat until the following day. However, de Valence's forces encountered Bruce's forces while they were camped several miles away that evening, constituting an egregious betrayal of the English commander's word. Bruce eked out of the carnage with minimal effort, as he was forced to endure severe casualties. The Prince of Wales then captured Culdrummy Castle from the Scots on September 13, capturing Nigel, Bruce's brother, and a number of other senior Scottish monarch supporters. Sir Simon Fraser, who had previously served as a courtier at the English court, was among those who were transported to London and executed. This action was consistent with Edward's policy of exhibiting no clemency towards Bruce's supporters during the year 1306. The king remained unfit to exercise command on the battlefield due to his health condition. Although Bruce's campaign reached its nadir in the autumn and winter of 1306, circumstances started to improve in early 1307. Bruce possibly travelled to Ireland during the winter, while also bolstering his support in the Gaeltacht of Scotland in the Hebrides of western Scotland or the Orkneys. In early spring 1307, having been reinforced, he resumed his campaign in southwestern Scotland, where he waged guerrilla warfare. In April 1307, Bruce defeated de Valence's forces at the Battle of Glentrule, a minor setback, and then consolidated his gains at the Battle of Loudon Hill in Ayrshire, which served as more convincing indications that Edward would be unable to redress the situation in Scotland. Here, de Valence commanded a force of up to 3,000 men against a force of less than 1,000 Scots led by Bruce. However, the Scots effectively utilized the terrain to render de Valence's numerical advantage null and void. The utilization of spearmen produced the same outcome at Stirling Bridge many years prior, a decisive triumph for Bruce over the English. Evidently indignant at these recent reversals, which put an end to the possibility of a speedy resolution to the recent unrest in Scotland, Edward was enraged. This was the circumstances surrounding the demise of King Edward I. After several weeks had passed since the defeat at Loudon Hill, he assessed a portion of the English forces gathered at Carlisle Castle, situated in close proximity to the boundary. Despite his deteriorating health, he ultimately advanced north towards Scotland. After rapidly declining in health, Edward Longshanks succumbed to dysentery while camped at Borough by Sands, a location situated south of the Scottish boundary, on the morning of July 7, 1307. According to one account, Edward requested on his deathbed that his heart be transported to the Holy Land in order to initiate a new crusade, an endeavor that the monarch had long desired to undertake but had never had the opportunity to do so until now. On that summer morning in his 60th year, he would have passed away with the conviction that a substantial portion of his life's labor was, at the very least, unfinished and possibly doomed to fail, given that Scotland had just crowned its first monarch after a 10-year absence and Bruce had secured numerous victories against Edward's forces on the battlefield. Furthermore, he must have realized that regardless of how frequently he dispatched large armies into Scotland and appeared to establish control over the land, it invariably degenerated into rebellion within months. in the form of his son Edward, Prince of Wales, who succeeded him. Foreboding indications of a reign dominated by formidable favourites had already materialised. Edward, following several additional months of campaigning in Scotland, returned to the south and was crowned monarch in February 1308. England entered a period of political, social, and economic turmoil following Edward's demise. The 20-year reign of his son was characterised by disorder, as Edward II favoured a variety of political favourites who infuriated the English political establishment as a whole. This was exacerbated during the mid-1310s, when Europe experienced a series of extremely severe storms. This resulted in nearly 150 days of continuous rainfall in 1314, which was then followed by widespread agricultural failures and one of the most catastrophic famines in the history of the continent. An outbreak of a highly virulent strain of cattle disease transpired concurrently, resulting in a precipitous decline in livestock populations. Tens of thousands of people perished throughout England due to these occurrences. And although Edward III, who succeeded Edward II as king in 1327, proved to be a far more competent ruler, the Black Death, one of the most catastrophic plague epidemics in human history, decimated more than half of Europe's population in the 1340s and 1350s. Perhaps a measure of the strength of the English state that had emerged by the end of Edward I's reign was the fact that Edward III, his grandson, was able to wage a sustained war against France in an attempt to re-establish England's territorial empire on the continent despite the plagues and famines of the 14th century, which caused demographic and economic anarchy. However, in the end, Edward's endeavours to subjugate Scotland to English dominion were unsuccessful subsequent to his demise. Robert Bruce emerged as the unequivocal leader of the Scottish independence movement during the late 1300s. With the expansion of his military forces, he exerted increasing pressure on the English presence in Scotland. Following his triumph at the Brander Pass in 1308, which occurred during the final weeks of Edward's tenure, he expelled the English from Edinburgh. Nevertheless, the pivotal confrontation did not transpire until 1314, when Edward II's forces were decisively defeated by the Scots at the Battle of Bannockburn. Edward, brother of Bruce, invaded Northern Ireland the following year, initiating a 3-year campaign that aimed to undermine England's determination to remain in Scotland through the establishment of a secondary front across the Irish Sea. However, the conflict continued, and in 1320, the Scottish nobility promulgated the Declaration of Arbroath, which proclaimed their autonomy from England. This stance was subsequently sanctioned by the Pope in 1324. However, it was not until the Battle of Stanhope Park in 1327, which was an additional significant military triumph, that the conflict that Edward I had initiated more than 3 decades prior reached its conclusion with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. At this treaty, England formally recognised the independence of Scotland and crowned Robert Bruce King of Scotland. King Edward's remains were embalmed and transported south following his demise in Scotland. It remained in state at Waltham Abbey for a considerable duration prior to his ultimate interment at Westminster Abbey on October 27, 1308, which occurred approximately 4 months subsequent to his demise. The mausoleum was constructed in an unadorned fashion using Purbeck limestone, which was extracted from the island of Purbeck in the county of Dorset. This was not elaborate, and the tomb did not contain a regal effigy. Surprisingly, this austerity might have been the result of insufficient funds to provide a more opulent interment. Edward's wars, notwithstanding the fiscal and administrative reforms implemented during his tenure, were of such immense expense that they largely bankrupted England. The tomb was uncovered in 1774 by the Royal Society of Antiquaries of London, which discovered that Edward's remains were in excellent condition more than 450 years later. By that time, the tomb bore an inscription that had undergone significant fading. It had been appended by John Feckenham, the final abbot of Westminster, around the middle of the 16th century. A segment of it bore the inscription Malleus Scotorum, which translates to the Scots hammer. Subsequently, Edward acquired this appellation in acknowledgement of the way in which the Scottish War came to shape his reign, whether positively or negatively, and notwithstanding the ultimate lack of success of the undertaking. Edward I was without a doubt one of the most influential monarchs in medieval England. Primarily, he implemented reforms and rejuvenated the crown government, following decades of turmoil under his grandfather and father. During this period, 2 civil wars had broken out, the majority of French territories had been lost, and the Welsh princes had gained de facto independence over a significant portion of Wales. The imperial government was impressively reconstructed during the 1270s and 1280s, with reforms implemented to strengthen English control over Gascony and Wales, which was reconquered through an extensive Anglicisation program. Although he did not succeed in fully conquering Wales, Edward made the greatest contribution of any monarch to that endeavour. Although this may not be considered a significant accomplishment by many Welsh individuals, when examined solely through the lens of a hegemonistic state in the High Middle Ages, it was a noteworthy feat of Edward's reign. It compelled the Welsh lords to submit to the English crown once more and advanced a progression that had begun in Wales during the Norman conquest of the 12th century. While not personally proficient in administration, Edward appointed several competent individuals to senior ministerial positions at home. These individuals oversaw a reform program that reformed English land law, tax collection, and other measures. As a result, the English fiscal and administrative state was fortified, enabling it to wage the wars of the latter half of Edward's reign. In the 1290s, however, the difficulties of Edward's reign began to accumulate. Since 1292, when he endorsed John Balliol's assertion of sovereignty over Scotland as a subject monarch, his resolve to subjugate Scotland to English dominion grew steadily. Similar to Wales, this must be examined through the lens of the late 13th century. Edward did not explicitly consider himself to be the conqueror of a foreign country. Instead, his perspective was that he was re-establishing a system of English governance in Scotland that had been established during the reigns of William the Conqueror and William II. Despite experiencing a significant decline during the intervening time, he perceived the succession crisis in 1290 as a strategic opportunity to compel the Scottish lords to acknowledge him once more as their liege lord. However, the situation became more intricate in 1294 when he became entangled in a conflict with France, which foreshadowed the 100 Years' War that commenced 40 years later under the leadership of his grandson. Edward's brief endeavours in this regard were utterly futile and produced no advantages for the French or himself. However, it was in Scotland that the situation significantly deteriorated. Edward almost certainly felt a tremendous sense of accomplishment in 1296, when he defeated the Scots and effectively subsumed Scotland into England, depriving the Northern Kingdom of its own monarch for the next 10 years, including one who Edward had appointed to function as a vassal similar to John Balliol in 1292. Nonetheless, triumph in the northern region was perpetually transitory. Under leaders such as Wallace and de Mornay, the Scots ascended to power in 1297. In 1298 and 1305, Edward appeared to have reduced them once more. However, a new uprising emerged shortly after his return to England and the dust settled on both occasions. The last, led by Robert Bruce in early 1306, who ascended to the throne of Scotland following a 10-year interregnum, was ultimately successful and resulted in the re-establishment of Scottish independence many years later. In your opinion, what is King Edward I? Had he been one of the most paradoxical monarchs in English history, establishing a centralized, powerful English state while tarnishing his legacy with his actions in Scotland and expulsion of the nation's Jewish community? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.